Well, hello, Jack Skelly. And hello, Sissy at Kingsley Manor. Please say hi to my mom when you see her, Edith. We'll be recording the evening so that you'll be able to show it to friends or take another look at it when you want. Okay, we're going to get started in about 1 minute. Make sure you have your libation handy and a good snack. There will be an intermission, so you'll be able to refill your glass. Of the river is a red-winged blackbird, twittering in the trash bags, festooned across the branches of cottonwood like prayer flags. The freeways are louder than the river. The I-5, the 110, the LB overwhelm the river and its tributaries with their roar. But when the tributaries bring their gifts of rainwater to the main stem, the river can be louder than the thunder rolling out of the San Gabriels. The voice of the river is the golf balls clanking in the power towers, and the kids on their bicycles laughing as they spot the mud people moving along the sandbars in silent meditation. I hear the river singing through the passing railroad cars, the screeching metal as a Metrolink commuter train tears apart. News choppers circling overhead, the howling ambulance sirens, followed by the coyote pack's howl. The high-pitched chi and the endless meetings, always one or two more, the laptops clicking, the TMDLs, the BMPs, the RFPs, the SSOs and the UAAs, the murmuring bureaucrats, the sharp whack of gavels, the deep voice of command, the swooping bats, and the swallows and swifts. I listen for them to make my own hearing more acute. The scream of a fish hawk, the flapping of 100 pigeons, and the rock droves to scatter in fear. A great blue heron's sorrowful honk, the trill and ripple of water. At the center of itself, the river is silence, and that's where I come in, with the sounds in my head and the words in my heart. Hi,
I'm Rex Weiner coming to you live from Lewis MacAdams Riverfront Park, probably the only park in Los Angeles named after a poet. It's not far from where I live here in Elysian Valley, also known as Frogtown. We're a few steps away from the river, the Los Angeles River, one of nature's gifts that sustain the people who were here before us. The Chumash, the Tongva, and which has sustained me over these long lockdown months. Lewis was famously, notoriously, a champion for the river, and he's probably the only poet ever to win a $1 billion grant. All for the river, of course. A 40-year art project, he called it, bringing it back to life. For all of his celebrated work on behalf of the river, MacAdams' poetry is also an achievement worth celebrating. On behalf of the Elysian Valley Arts Collective and Beyond Baroque Literary Arts, I've asked friends, family, and a posse of poets to join me here to read Lewis's work. Some came by the park earlier, and you'll meet them soon. And everybody else, well, imagine we're all gathered together on the riverbank. ZJ Patterson, start the show.
Hi, I am Phoebe MacAdams Ozuna, and I am Lewis's first wife. We got married in 1967. And I met Lewis in a pizza parlor in Princeton, New Jersey when I was in high school. He was a student at Princeton and I was what they called a townie. He came up to me and asked me if I liked penguins. Well, I was fascinated, of course, by this hip-looking college student, and we started dating and kept dating while I spent 2 years in college. I eventually dropped out and we married in 1967 and went to live in Buffalo, New York, where Lewis was a graduate student at SUNY Buffalo. Eventually, we ended up in Bolinas, California, and had 2 children before we separated. Although Lewis and I divorced in 1978, we have been friends since the day we met. It has been a long road that we walked together, ending only with his death. And though we needed to separate, I have never regretted marrying Lewis. We have 2 wonderful children and 3 amazing grandchildren. But in addition, Lewis introduced me to a world. He opened the world of poetry to me, and poetry became my world. I am deeply grateful to him for this. I was amazed by the poets of the Lower East Side of New York City, and even more so by the folks in Bolinas. In Bolinas, we created a town that was based on the wild spirit of words. It was an astonishing community to be part of, one that is still ongoing, and one that I treasure. So thank you, Lewis. The poem I'm going to read refers to the first time I heard Lewis read so many years ago. Poet's Work for Lewis MacAdams. This morning, the birds ate most of the black sunflower seeds, and I fill up the feeder, watch squirrels on the grass, look at asparagus fern in the garden, and read old poems. I move from room to room and think about my sister, my mother. I sit quietly for a long time, then mail letters and observe the hummingbird. I am thinking of the eastern Sierras and the sweep of mountains up to the red-tailed hawk's air current glide. Now I am looking at the yellow Buddha cat and the bright red minutes of Holly's clock. The first time I heard a poem, the poet fell right off the stool, and I thought, why, yes, that must be the voice of God. And the last thing I'm going to read, actually, this was something I found last night. When Lewis was ill, he and I would go and see him and check in once a week or so. And occasionally I would help him write a poem. I mean, he had a hard time sort of keeping track of his thoughts. But I would help him, and I typed this up, and I believe this is the last poem. And it is a poem that is written for Joanne Kiger, all our mentor one and all, who lived in Bolinas. The world as seen from Joanne Kiger's kitchen window. A butterfly flutters on in a cone of light. It's night. The mud puddles on Evergreen Road reflect the sky at sunset. The great work will never be complete or left undone. The puddles on the path will neither be empty or filled. The night is so dark, you can't even see your reflection on Evergreen Road turning into a path. What can I tell you? She's gone. By Lewis MacAdams. Thank you very much.
These two poems go back to when I knew Lewis best, which was in Bolinas, where we both lived most of the 70s. I arrived in 1972 after Lewis and Phoebe arrived, and he was a very welcoming guy, and have very fond memories of both Bolinas and Lewis in that period. Now, the thing that is interesting about Bolinas is that I guess I was just about to turn 29. Lewis, I think we're about the same age. And here was this place that just a year earlier had had a recall election, and most of the town, the political, what we'd call it, the directors of the town had switched from old timers to people who were our age, and many of whom I quickly knew. And this poem that I'm going to read is called Directors of the PUD. And what it refers to is the Bolinas. It was actually known as the BPUD, which is the Bolinas Public Utilities District. And the directors he refers to here, I don't know whether he actually was a director, but he certainly knew all of these people, which you get from the poem. So this is Directors of the PUD. Last night, we sat around the table plotting how to spend the town's money wisely. Orville said something. Bill, his sleepy eyes, he ate granola. Does Paul know himself? Flushed, his fingers move across an envelope. Orville, pale, holds his heart. His forehead throbs, and Paul discerns a new bottom line. Bill pops wood into the fire and spins around. We must face our neighbors with this information. Is it right? So what's interesting here is that here's the people he's referring to. The first one, Orville, is Orville Shell, who was become a major liaison with China at this point. I think some kind of head of the national some kind of committee that's in contact with the Chinese. And at that time, before that, he was the head of the journalism department at Berkeley. And Bill is Bill Nyman. And if you go to an organic grocery store, you'll find Nyman bacon, which is cultivated in Bolinas. And Paul is Paul Kafitz, who's an attorney who fought for the recall election because they wanted to hook us up with a town and a sewer system that they didn't want to do. So these are all these very familiar characters, and it's a wry poem. It's typical of Lewis. He kind of undercuts the authority, and then he comes in with his own authority. We must face our neighbors with this information. Is it right? And this is from a book of his called Live at the Church that came out when we were all living in Bolinas, published by Culture Press. And on the opposite page, or on the other side of the page, is Joanne's birthday. Now, Joanne Kiger is a famous poet of the sort of the Beat period and was our neighbor, and really a wonderful musical poet. And this she's a little older than us, and this celebrates her 40th birthday. Joanne's birthday. Joanne Kiger had her 40th birthday a few months ago, and Susanna Acevedo threw a surprise party for her and invited nearly everyone in town. All the poets and artists and sandal makers and leather workers and scrimshaw designers and seamstresses and jewelers and dealers and singers and smugglers. Is that smugglers or snugglers? It's smugglers. And astrologers vied with each other to see who could give Joanne the most beautiful present. It was a Dakini birthday, and at one point I was standing in the hall watching Joanne receiving her tributes. There was a mountain of gifts already on the table and a mountain on the floor, and the artists would come up to her humbly with their gifts, and she would make gestures like, how nice, or, oh, really, you're so sweet. And when it was my turn, I approached Joanne with this poem with trepidation. Would it be enough? It's that same question. The other one ends with, to Joanne, willows and iris grow around, through, across, and right out of the roof of an old wrecked Chrysler. It's beautiful, floating through the edge of the meadow on its way to the woods. Old friends sit in the sprung front seats and smile for the camera. Little girls grown into young women grown into a great lady. So, and this was this really special community. It was like the 60s continued, which after a while was a little bit of a strain, but it was a very interesting time and a very interesting place to be, very liberating.
Lewis and I met when we were kids in high school, growing up in Dallas. And I want to read two poems that I have some personal connection to, and they bring back Lewis for me. This was Lewis's very first book of poetry called City Money, and it came out in 1966. And at the time, his mother was taken to the hospital because they thought she might have cancer. And this poem called Parkland Hospital is about her. Yellow, Japanese tree. Outside the window, some mongoloid woman yells, please, please help me. In the next room, my mother is okay. Doesn't have a cancer after all. Texas, winter, sunlight. The next poem I'm going to read is from a book he wrote that he published 4 years ago, and it was published by Harper and Row. And I think it might have been Lewis's only book that was published by like a major publisher. He had been publishing in Rolling Stone and Paris Review, so he was able to get this deal. Here is the book. It's called The Poetry Room. And the short poem I'm going to read is about a trip that he and I took together. We turned out that we both, in addition to going to meeting in high school and knowing each other in college and going back and forth, it turned out that we both went to the State University of New York at Buffalo together, and then wound up living in LA. And so, you know, we kind of knew each other forever. And this poem is about a car trip that we took from Dallas, our hometown, to Buffalo, and it's called Via Radio. Church of the Static God, Static Railroad Wrestle. Keep right. Raise your right hand one time. Greencastle, Indiana. One more time for me. Hosier Diner. S.H. Kress. Southern Delish. At your service for years. Us steely, mysterious characters shift seats, move through as the light falls from amber into the black land. The eagle wraps its wings around the earth and shakes. Do we need any gas? How far's the next station? US 40 East and traveling. So with those two poems, I send my love out to Lewis's spirit that continues to inform and galvanize us all. Thank you.
We're here in the Glendale Narrows in the soft bottom section of the Los Angeles River, Frogtown, Atwater, Elysian Valley. What do you want to call it? I want to call it in honor of my man, Mr. Lewis MacAdams, that I met at the Los Angeles River Center in 1999 on a night that he read with Mike Davis and Gary Snyder. I love Lewis, and he's been very good to me. I used to work down the street at a spot called Cashmere Sound Distribution, and Lewis's son, Torrey MacAdams, hung out with me there a few times, about 2004, 2005. But let me read section 6 from this book, Dear Oxygen, and his cycle of poems called The River. At the overflow ponds between the river and the Virginia Country Club, I saw a great blue heron regurgitate its lunch, a foot-long carp that was still struggling for its life. As he beat it to death against a rock, his wings raised, his shoulders hunched, the blue wards off a snowy white American egret that's jabbing its beak into the back of the blues, trying to get at his food. The Blue Line train rumbles by overhead with its passengers, pointed towards Los Angeles. No one even looks up from their newspapers, the Press Telegram and the Daily Breeze. This is in honor of Lewis.
Dale Hurd. I'm a longtime friend of Lewis's. We first met at the Poetry Center in San Francisco State. So far back, I can't even remember the date. He was the director of the Poetry Center, and he asked me to read from a book of short stories that I'd written, and I read with Bobby Louise Hawkins, who was married to Robert Creeley. And Lewis and I became friends, and he moved to Los Angeles, and I followed him through his various adventures up until this moment, where I'd like to read a few of his poems that I think are pretty emblematic of him. Lewis was a person who was a high romantic, and the motto that he has, if it's not impossible, it doesn't interest me, really applied to his romantic life. The women that he pursued were what I would consider impossible women. And so these poems kind of reflect his feelings about that. And the first one I want to read is from a book called Lyrics. And it's a chapbook put out by Blue Press Books in Santa Cruz. Kevin Oaksedal is the publisher. And the first poem I want to read is called Valentine Pieces, after Jesse Winchester. Meeting you for tea was a complete disaster. We both noticed our judgments collapse. We started talking about how pathetic we were. I handed you a Valentine gingerbread heart and you tore it to pieces while I doubled up with laughter. How did we run into each other? Was it simply the desire to stay indoors and watch the storm sweep in from the coast, blowing shoppers down the street ahead of it like they were dead branches? You showed me a flying machine that didn't fly because it was art. The waiter took away the menus before we could order. We gave each other pep talks about compassion. You half promised to ring me when you got back from Scotland. I half promised to call you the next time I visited your universe. Then we were gone. The next one is also in that vein. Date. The Wilderness Casanova, the Roadshore Show Marquis de Sade. Neither one of us could quench the drowning. You still believe in the Melgrano Sea, obviously, the empty mirror in a puddle of water. I heard Bob Dylan try to explain to his parole officer, who was begging him to cool it, till I finished taking his musical cure. Time out of mind and love and theft. I was just about to call you when you came at me on Facebook. Then you opened up my heart and climbed in. It was your place to do that. You were at home everywhere. Your money could pay 100 peasants to string your Xmas lights, thousands to grow your corn. And then stranger than kindness. I still can't believe neither one of us knew any better. I mean, that wasn't the first time a brick wall dressed up as the stairway to heaven. Now that we're both numb, we don't have to pretend that it all made more sense than it actually did. When the sunlight poured through your curtains like a caramel-colored coffee, and I rolled over to see your wild curls poking out from around the face of a stranger.
Now I'm going to read half of a poem that is not in Dear Oxygen. It's a poem called Springtime in the Void. It was in a book. This was a big deal. He was still 25, a book from Harper and Row called The Poetry Room. I don't know if you can find it. Gerard Malanga cover, Gerard Malanga back cover. I'm reading this because it has everything, as I just told Rex. This is the ripeness of Lewis's immaturity. He is using about 4 or 5 identifiable influences, but somehow he's just pushed his whole genius into it. Very lively, and I'm going to attempt to read it well. Remember, this is called Springtime in the Void. It's obviously when you lived in San Francisco. Troubadour, pay this final toll, turn around in the gleam and swack of high wind. A building collapses, my stomach. 200 flagmen wave me on through, the little lady swollen with babies out riding through the drop of tears that illuminate 3rd Street afternoons. A gray ball swings and one era roars into dust, a huge nozzle cooling the remains. Spare change? Beg anything, any pure desire, and the boys will get their wish, to be dandies and highwaymen, rip off their clothes and be innocent, to reward mom with a letter home, sky that full of mercy. And I got a dime, so I'm crossing Mission Street, rolling, gleaming, no hands, no feet, no body, not me, ma. Just a pure hunk of windy coastal daylight, singing through the canyons towards a luncheon with my baby and our billion children of light. I take a hit, a whiff, some breath, a taste, and step off the doorstep out into space. I'm glad to have done this. I would like to tell people that Monday, October 12th, was Lewis's birthday. My best to everybody, some of you I know. Thanks.
I'm Kevin Opstedall. I'm a poet. I live in Santa Cruz, California, although I was born and raised in Venice Beach. Lewis and I were friends for a long time, since 1976, actually. And there are many of MacAdams' poems that I love and return to continually. But one of my perennial favorites is this short, untitled 3-line poem. It was first published in 1972, a chapbook called Dance. Actually, I have it here. This chapbook, Dance. And it was published by, it was part of the curriculum of the Soul series, which was edited by Jack Clark, who was one of Lewis's teachers at Buffalo. It also appeared in an early issue of Big Sky, which was edited by Bill Berkson and Bolinas. And when it was published there, it was in Lewis's hand, which kind of made it even more special to me. It's a real small poem, real short, but to me anyway, it packs a big wallop. Every time I see something beautiful, I fuck it up and bring it to you. There's a certain punk grace to that that I always thought was present in all of Lewis's poetry to some degree. And I told him that one time, and in fact suggested that he use that poem as his epitaph on his gravestone. And he had a big laugh out of that. But then, being the astute editor that he is, he said, oh, well, but we'll have to change it. It'll have to read, every time I saw something beautiful, I fucked it up and brought it to you. He was a great poet. And I miss my friend.
Red River, in memory of Frank O'Hara, by Lewis MacAdams. Peter and Linda in my car gone to East Hampton. In a bar on 3rd Avenue, the rail, enough money from this job for beer, swampy, unpleasant day, Phoebe coming in mad, and rightly so, false claim of facts. No one home on the Lower East Side. Streets are filled with Me Too, uptown to dinner. Peter talks poetry, explains his dispatch. The food is rotten. Linda says at the funeral, friends stood in clumps, like people in galleries who know each other. Fire engines go back down Broadway. Peter downtown writing out the details. Phoebe and I, too tired, go home to straighten out. The girl is sleeping. I'm smoking, inelegant, as was never allowed in his poems, which spoke of small graces we must master to live in ecstasy in New York City.
My name is Andre Nafis-Haley. I'm a poet, and I'm here today to read a poem by Lewis MacAdams. I'm actually writing a profile on MacAdams's life and work for the Poetry Foundation, which should hopefully come out sometime soon. I just wanted to thank Phoebe Ozuna and Rex Weiner for the chance to read tonight. I'll be reading the opening section of MacAdams's A Poem for the Dawn of the Terror Years, one of my particular favorites of his, and which I think is particularly apt for our times. A Poem for the Dawn of the Terror Years. September 15th, 2001. In my heart for the faithful who do these things. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. William Burroughs sounded a word of warning. There's no limit to the amount of damage an idealist can do. Death in our eyes as we contemplate the dead presidents. Death in our nostrils for the holy man. Death in the flood of the dazed survivors, wandering uptown covered with ash, still clutching their briefcase and their useless cell phones. In Dante's Inferno, revenge is seen as a man gnawing on a human skull forever. Death on the lips of the godheads and flag bearers. Death pounding against the aortal walls. Death demanding a radical innocence like you don't want to kill somebody in the naked sky when the buildings fall down. After fielding my son's nervous questions, I meander down to the river, where I look up when I hear the rumble of the first passenger airplane in 4 days. For minutes, it's louder than the quaking mallard harbingers of the great autumnal pulse. Then it's gone, winging its way up north. It must have felt like this at the fall of Rome, with the stench of victory still in their ears. You just wanted to get as far away from it as you could. The sorrow slipping away, the fury and the hatred gathering in the shallows and gliding across the channel. I study the Arundo Donax and the Willow, those ancient enemies, invader and invaded, as they battle in the lights fading, and try to counter the violence with my silence. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joe Linton. I am a river activist and artist, and was proud to be a friend of Lewis MacAdams. I wrote this guidebook to the Los Angeles River called Down by the LA River. Happy to tag out several books and look stuff over, and I'm going to be reading a poem from the River, Book 3. It's called 37, River Boy, the Mask. I built this river, not with my hands, but with my imagination. Now it's Super Bowl Sunday, and the Eagles are underdogs to the Patriots. So practice the patience that you learned from the sedge, which is unchanged for millennia because deal with the waiting birds to write their sacred names with cloudbursts on moving water. I built this river, not with my dreams, but with my drama. Though now I feel it ebbing, drying up, and cracking like a mud man's mask. I built this river with my karma, just so I would have a park bench to sit on when I had no other place to go. And that actually is sort of, it's a later poem. It reminds me of Lewis MacAdams aging and having the river to go to. So thank you so much, Lewis MacAdams.
Well, we're going to take a little break, but that was a magnificent series of readings. Really thrilling to hear them read. So Lewis MacAdams' work read so well. I don't know if you can see behind me, but we have the sun going down on the river. We're going to come back for more oxygen in 5 minutes. So please fetch yourself a snack or tend to the loo or fill your glass. But we'll be back for some more. So hang in there. Intermission. Okay, everybody, we're back. I want to thank ZJ Patterson for putting together that wonderful collage of my photography images that I've captured over the past year that I've lived here. And I also want to thank, among our sponsors, Tracy Stone, who is the president of one of the co-founders of the Elysian Valley Arts Collective, and someone who got me into all of this. So thanks again. And we're going to get started. Hello again to Kingsley Manor. So glad to see you there. And everyone else, I'm just thrilled to have you with us. This book, I think Tilly Hinton commented on the many Post-its. I think we've got a few more poems to read. Let's take it away.
Dear, I'm having a beer. Dear Oxygen, thank you for breathing. Just because there's no snow on the slopes of Mount Baldy doesn't mean fire isn't raging at the center of the earth. I'm smiling, imagining you smiling. Dear Oxygen, thank you for the breath. Dear Oxygen number 2, even when I walk along a little creek that only trickles once in every 20 years, with you on my mind, I can hear you breathing. I can feel your breath.
My name is Shelley Backlar. I'm the Vice President of Programs for Friends of the Los Angeles River, and I've been with the organization since 2003. So Lewis and I were on quite a roller coaster ride or a kayak excursion, whatever you want to call it, but we worked very, very closely for years. So it is my honor to read these words that Lewis wrote before I ever knew him. I'm reading The Founding of the Friends of the Los Angeles River. Pat Patterson, Roger Wong, and me met Fred Fisher at the Old Challenge Dairy on Vignes Street for an early morning cup of coffee. We're on our way down to the river for the first time. We carry heavy-duty wire clippers to cut through the fence beside the First Street Bridge, courtesy of Greg Gannon. Then we climb down the steep cement-covered bank to the river. We don't know where we're going exactly. We walk upstream to where the Arroyo Seco flows into the Los Angeles. This must have been one of the most beautiful places. Around here once, a thicket, a confluence, an avalon at the meeting of year-round streams. Deer quiver at the edge of memory. Night herons splash. There are steelhead. We don't like to look back. Now there are railroad tracks on both banks of the river, 3 freeway bridges, the 10, the 110, and the 5 cross it. Through a tunnel gray with couches and people sleeping in abandoned automobiles, the Arroyo meekly flows. Since cement is just inverted riverbed, they have to repave it. Today there's 30 guys with jackhammers leveling the river ahead of an airport runway paving machine. The rivers, so we address ourselves to the river. We ask it if we can speak on its behalf in the human realm. We can't hear the river saying no, so we set to work. Lewis, thank you so much. You've changed my life, and I love you forever.
The Dark Bob. I think of myself as Lewis's best friend. I consider him my best friend. I hope he considered me his best friend. In fact, it wasn't more than 2 years ago, he did ask me to be the best man at his wedding when he met someone in his nursing care that he suddenly wanted to get married to. And I thought, you're crazy, Lewis, but you know, okay, if you want to get married, fine, and I'll be your best man. I'm going to read a poem from a book I have called, a book of Lewis's called Africa and the Marriage of Walt Whitman to Marilyn Monroe. And the poem is called L fucking A, and it's dedicated to Bob and Bob. I'm one of the Bobs that he's talking about there. And Bob and Bob, my partner and I, we were an art team in Los Angeles, starting many years ago in the 70s. Night in Los Angeles was at a very wild event that we had produced, a 24-hour performance that was quite insane, with 1,000 people painting on 100 feet of canvas and going wild as Bob and Bob provoked them through the night by saying things to get them all upset. So Lewis was a witness to that, and I'm sure it really affected, it did. He always said that, you know, that was his first night in Los Angeles, and it pretty much blew his mind. He knew a new life was about to begin for himself. So in my very limited capacity to be a good reader of poetry and prose, I'm going to attempt to read this poem because I love Lewis. So I'll do the best I can for Lewis. The bus depot lobby clock. So I walked outside and picked up a Newsweek at the newsstand. The newsboy eyed me from his stool. I turned to page 2, and the newsboy approached me with his hands bunched into his change apron, jingling his coins. He walked up to me so close I could smell his breath. "Yes, sir," he said. "Can I help you?" I put the Newsweek back on the rack and picked up a Wall Street Journal. "Will this newspaper help me get rich?" I asked. "A lot of people swear by it," said the newsboy. "How much is it?" 25 cents. "Well, if I don't buy it, then I'll already be richer by a quarter," I concluded, replacing the paper. "Very funny," said the newsboy, as his eyes narrowed. There was an arcade around the bus station, and I decided to explore. 20 minutes until my rendezvous. 15 minutes. Flies and bees buzzed in and out of open garbage cans strewn at the entrance to the souvenir stalls. In a filthy display window, a dummy modeled a dusty bathing suit next to a deflated beach ball. 10 minutes. At the back of the bus station was a taxi rank. The cabbies were snoozing in the heat, their visors with their off-duty signs turned down to shield their eyes from the light. I kept walking. On the south side of the station, I was drawn to a postcard stand. I looked through the cards for a few minutes until I found some great ones, then took them inside to pay. 5 minutes. Once outside, I realized this was more than a souvenir stand. Suspended from the old-fashioned high ceilings as scrolls and pinned to the walls and draped over work tables and display counters were many dozens, perhaps hundreds of beautifully brushed calligraphy, exquisitely painted hermit sages in bamboo forests, roaring tigers, cabins at the base of waterfalls, at the feet of mountains that disappeared into the mist. One particular tiger was so beautifully rendered that each brushstroke seemed to transcend the roaring tiger's roar. There was a large work area near the back of the shop where several assistants looked busily at work turning out new calligraphies and portraits, new calligraphies and portraits in various steps towards completion. The old proprietor put down his work and came toward the counter. I handed him my quarter. He reached out for the money with his right hand while taking hold of my left hand. He held my hand and looked at me. "You make very beautiful calligraphy here," I told him. "Oh, you know calligraphy?" "A little, not really." "I'm glad you like it. Would you like to try some?" I felt pressed. I was looking for the exit, but he was holding all the cards. I thought Paul might be outside already, circling the block. "Would you like to try?" Well, okay." The man went and fetched some thin pieces of paper and a slender brush, which he dipped into a bottle of ink. "What's your name?" I told him. He painted a pair of characters. "That is your name," he said, continuing to draw. "This is your life," he continued, without looking up. "This is your house," he nodded. "It will be found because it is not entirely lost." He looked up at me above his glasses, "But this time you will have to work at it much harder." He finished, He finished painting and smiled up at me. This is the Japanese character for the home. I'm putting it next to your name, okay? Well, for sure, I replied, and he rang up the sale. Dazed, I pocketed my cards and went outside to look for Paul. What the fuck? What the fuck? I kept asking myself. Who was that guy? And how did he know who I was? Is this really Los Angeles? I asked myself. It sure is, I answered, looking 6th Street up and down, and it's high noon.
I first met Lewis MacAdams many years ago when I was a graduate student from Australia, and I had decided to research the Los Angeles River, and I volunteered at Fola to try and find my way on a visit from Australia, just a quick research trip. I had no idea what I was doing, and I had little idea who I was, but Lewis became a friend, and for many years until his passing, I was so fortunate to be his friend, his mentee, and to learn so much about the river. I want to read one of the pieces that I love most from his corpus. For years, I thought I was going to find the old man of the river, a guru, who knew everything there was to know about it. He was going to draw me a map. Then I'd know what to do with the information that was written in my soul. I never found him until I caught my reflection in a puddle of rainwater. It was me, all along, bushy brows, balding skull, worried eyes, in awe of 8 egrets as they lift into the evening, pink light bathing their breasts, then turn northeast into the clouds, gathering above Mount Washington. Rest in peace, Lewis MacAdams.
This is a poem written by Lewis MacAdams. It's called The First Los Angeles River Artwalk. We gathered in the dust next to the First Street warehouse and pasted Friends of the Los Angeles River bumper stickers on each other's backs. There must have been 25 of us. There was no press except for high performance, the New Testament of performance art. We climbed down the bank and walked upstream. Keith Levine made a tape to move us, industrial music cut with reggae. The big bass bounced off the concrete walls from the box Keith pushed along in front of him in a wheelbarrow. We had to carry our friend, the Dark Bob, who was wearing flip-flops across the meandering rivulets of slime. The river's only green until we reached the scene where the concrete ends and the red-winged blackbirds begin to sing to the citizens of Frogtown. Lewis MacAdams. Cool.
I belong to the smoke, from a wood fire, to the bending south, to the hills of earth, and to the imagination. Extra Gallic poetry lovers, yet intense, remember me as one who called himself a country boy, yet wrung his song out of the city. Look, she pointed excitedly, frogs. Frogs, I shouted back. We ran over to take their pictures, to take back to the other human, to prove to them that all was not yet lost in the race to rebuild the aunt's lair.
Dear American people, I've just got to talk to you about your government. You are the government the way that we are the earth and sky, the way we are the blood and the government the branches of the tree. You and I are the government, and we need no more amateur presidents. Once again, if you and I are the suit, the government's the tie we wear into the world. America, we are the fabric, and to knit that tie together takes statecraft. Is it too much to ask ourselves to pay attention? To make of government a proper tool? To make of governing a skill and craft to steer the ship of earth into the daylight? And there's an epigraph that goes with this untitled piece. If politics were the science of humanity, by the great Dr. William Carlos Williams of New Jersey. And the quote I put on here was from the memorial written for Lewis by Julia Ingalls. And she asked him, what's the hardest thing about being a poet? And he says, being a poet. However, I would suggest that this river is his poetry. All of us being here right now together is his poetry. This park is his poetry. And the poem's indestructible, as Lewis proves to us through his good work. And again, us being here today. And I knew Lewis over the years. I wasn't super close to him, but I knew him. And the way I would always see Lewis besides readings, I'd see him in public in the grocery store parking lot. And so it was always cool seeing him like in the middle of the night and stuff, and we'd chat. And the first time I met Lewis actually was in New York City. My ex-wife had won a trip to New York from a game show. I forget, tic-tac-toe, I think. So we took the trip to New York, and What Happened to Kerouac was playing, just opening, I think, somewhere maybe in the Village, I'm not sure. So I took an epic cab ride to see the film. And that's how I met Lewis, and it was a pleasure to be able to meet him sometime later and tell him all about the movie, and he told me about his involvement in it and everything else. So just like the river that crosses all things, ultimately we all cross one another together, apart, and back together again. And this poem tells you all about it, man. Dear American people, I just want to talk to you about your government.
I'm honored to participate in this tribute to Lewis MacAdams, a person with whom I've worked over the years. I'm Zev Yaroslavsky. I'm a former member of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors and the City Council. Lewis and my office have worked for many years to try to save and resurrect the river, the Los Angeles River, and his vision and passion for this resource of ours is unparalleled. So I'm honored to be here and to read one of his poems, The Artesians by Lewis MacAdams. Desert winds shower date palm pollen across our shoulders as we hold each other in thrall. Desert rains swell vernal pools with our hard-earned secrets gleamed from many lives along the river's edge. Desert cold, and so what if there's no other worldly way we can be together? We are married to the community, and we won't sleep until the yellow-billed cuckoos are singing in the sycamores and the steelhead trout are swimming through Burbank and Glendale on their way upstream to spawn. Thank you, Lewis.
My name is Jeffrey Johnson. I am a resident of Glendale, have been for about 6 years, and I've been finding great solace in my trips down the bike path the last few years, last few months especially. And I never knew Lewis MacAdams, but when I heard of his passing, I did a kind of a deep dive and really fell in love with some of the stuff because it spoke right to my heart. So I'm an actor here in town. I do voiceover work. You might, if you listen to the radio or TV, you might have heard me talking on a T-Mobile spot about unlimited 4G LTE data. But that's just a side hustle, but I'm happy to have it. And I'm happy to be here today to read to you Leo Del Rio. How do people get their river names? They find them in the cattails or catch them with a cloud. They hear them whispered in the eucalyptus leaf floating down the wind. You got yours, pedaling up and down the river on your Schwinn, a bouquet of Krylon paint cans sticking out of the basket on your handlebars. That's Leo Del Rio.
Hello, I am Kate Walsh. I am an artist, an author, illustrator, and an educator for kids and kids at heart. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, so I discovered Lewis MacAdams in the same way that a born and raised Los Angelonian discovers the river, a slow love affair. First, you drive over the bridge when you're little and you roll your eyes at anyone said it's a river. And then as I made my home and built my own roots in this area, I discovered little pockets of it, little corners with Lewis MacAdams poems as I started to do projects along with the river. So I am going to continue to discover the river and Lewis MacAdams, I know, for many, many days, and hopefully make a lot of art inspired by both. Today, I will be reading The Confluence by Lewis MacAdams. I recognized you the minute I saw you. Something about the way you wore your jeans and talked about your kids. Something in the way the storm waters slid together, their confluences, sluicing in and out of each other. In the April flood, rushing seaward together in the coffee-colored froth and the cream-colored waves. Thank you, Lewis MacAdams.
Thank you very much. This is Mike Millette, leader of the LA Mud People. I didn't realize that for many years, but it's true. Poet, performance artist, visual artist. I will read a poem by Lewis MacAdams, Hymn to the Bottom Feeders. Open up a storm drain manual to characters out of Joel Peter Whitkin, flabby, masked, and naked, staring up at us from an undersea tableau of ooze. Pieces of body parts float to the surface, the whitish bellies of bottom feeders, catfish, tilapia, carp. Thousands of bodies bump gently against the foot of the Sepulveda Dam, keeping time with the current, suffocated in the caustic soda, courtesy of Anheuser-Busch. Today, the river is a toxic waste. They have of his mouth in 18-wheelers. That's why we stand on the Sunnybrook footbridge, each of us carrying a glass from purer waters. Mine was the juice from my roots, high up in the Arroyo Hondo, north of Bolinas, where the hawks nest, where the spring-fed waters bubble over moss and watercress, where you can smell the bay laurel. A woman blows a long note on a Tibetan horn, and we pour our waters into the bottom feeders' upstretched mouths. Nice piece.
So the poem I'm going to read is called To Artesia. And this poem is on the statue where his face, his recognition of his face is in Lewis MacAdams Riverfront Park, AKA Marsh Park. And I read this at the beginning of river tours when I give them to groups of people. So here it is. To Artesia. I think of the river the way it reads in a Sam Shepard story, Cruising Paradise. A huge concrete serpent, a dumping ground for murder victims. I think of the river besides a freeway off-ramp as rollerbladers bent into it, spandex buttocks rotating, roll downstream. I think of William Mulholland's gentle limpid stream, coursing from a pharaoh's forehead or from the brow of a Rhine maiden, green-eyed and coffee-colored, a bracelet of drowned children wrapped around her wrist. descending from the mountains east of Ermindale into the Jardin de Rocas. The river is a rigorous mistress, but when you tickle her with your deeds, you can hear laughter from beneath her concrete corset. Thank you, Lewis, for those words, and that last piece at the end, the tickling her with our deeds, just really strikes me every time.
Hi out there, this is Man One, LA-based artist, and I'm happy to be here and had the honor to do a reading of one of Lewis's poems entitled Last November. Here we go. Hard yellow efflorescence, the color of calamity. Still, the burrito king in his palace. His homemade Mexicatessen, protected by chain link fences and a half dozen video cameras. Then what's wrong with this picture? Thank you, Lewis. You're awesome. Love you. Peace.
My name is Natalia, Lewis's daughter. And today I'm going to be reading a poem that is in front of the Heron Gates in Frogtown. And I also have it tattooed on my leg. And it's a poem that was written for my mom. And here it goes. I wish you would walk with me here more often. Red-winged blackbirds nesting in the cattails, electricity humming in the high tension lines.
Well, thank you, Natalia, for that poem. I wish you could all be walking with me right now by the river. I don't know if you can see the snowy egrets down there. As the sun goes down over the fishermen fishing for giant carp. We've had a wonderful evening, and I thank ZJ Patterson for putting a lot of this together. I thank you all for coming without leaving your homes. And Phoebe, thank you for helping bring everybody together. It's been amazing, this gathering in celebration of Lewis MacAdams' words. And as the sun goes down over the LA River, bid you all wonderful evening, peace. Thanks to Beyond Baroque, the Elysian Valley Arts Collective, also Council Member Mitch O'Farrell, who backs this as well. Adios, hasta la vista, mucho paz, abrazos. Please stick around, schmooze in the chat box if you like. Live webcast.
got a few minutes before the event begins, so grab a cold drink, settle in, say hello on the chat. And if you haven't gotten your flu shot, please get it. If you haven't voted, please vote. And that's the end of the PSAs, but we'll be back in a few minutes. And the party will begin. And a quick reminder also that today's event will be recorded. So if you don't wish to be videoed, turn your video off. And we'll remind you a couple of times of that just in case you forget. The other thing you should be looking at, and many of the images here are coming from LA River X, which is an Instagram account. It's currently being hosted by El Priest, the saddest marionette in Los Angeles, and his puppet master, Cain Arias. So images are coming from that space. You can join the Instagram account, which is one of my favorite ones to go to every day, just to see what's new on the river. And the images that are flowing in from that very special place. And I hope you enjoy them. Billy Hinton has just posted the Instagram account in the chat. So if you would like to click on it and join in, please do. In a few minutes, I'll introduce the amazing Patt Morrison, who will take over the show. Amazing for many reasons, not least of which is her extraordinary writing and hosting, but also because she has some of the coolest hats anywhere. So you'll enjoy it. For those of you who have just joined us, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here for the LA River X panel discussion. Look at the LA River. What do you see? For many of us, it's an extraordinary landscape that we had to discover and slowly piece together what it might mean for us. I love taking my students down there. We get to slop around in the river. A kind of baptism of sorts, and it's been a fabulous way to help them understand that what looks like a concrete ditch is a concrete ditch, but it's also a river and a natural system, as this beautiful photograph demonstrates. I'll soon be introducing today's moderator, Patt Morrison, an acclaimed writer, columnist, and broadcaster. But for the moment, a couple more minutes while people trickle in. Why don't you grab something cold to drink, hang out, give us a hello in the chat, which would be lovely. And we'll begin very soon. A reminder that the Instagram account, LA River X, is in the chat. If you would like to join. And if you have visual stories to tell about the river, you can apply to be a guest host of LA River X. You can send a direct message on Instagram to Tilly Hinton, founder and curator of LA River X, and your materials can begin to show on the account, which would be great. It's one of the places I love going to on a daily basis, just to see the river and its changing life. And its life ways. So in a few minutes, we'll begin the conversation about this remarkable urban river that is often seen but not understood, and actually not always seen. For those of you who have joined us in the last couple of minutes, just so you know, this event will be recorded. So if you leave your video on, you will be part of the recording. And if that's not something you want, I suggest you keep your video off. But it will be recorded also so that we can share this with others over time, which would be great. Welcome to our panel today, LA River X panel discussion. Look at the LA River. What do you see? It's not as simple a question as it seems. It actually is pretty complex because how we see something and what we interpret what we have seen are not usually always the same thing. And helping us work our way through these subjects, through these various eyes and ways of thinking about this space is Patt Morrison, the remarkable LA Times writer, columnist, and podcaster who has a share of 2 Pulitzers. She's won 6 Emmys, a dozen Golden Mike Awards in her years hosting public TV and public radio programs. She appears weekly on Spectrum News's LA Times Today, an Emmy Award-winning program. She co-produced and hosted the national syndicated television program, The Book Show with Patt Morrison. She's a very busy human being. And her new book, Don't Stop the Presses, Truth, Justice, and the American Newspaper, is a bestseller, as was her seminal nonfiction book about the river, Rio LA, Tales from the Los Angeles River, about the city's phantom waterway. Her writing appears in both fiction and nonfiction anthologies, and Pink's, the legendary Hollywood hot dog stand, named its vegetarian hot dog, the Patt Morrison Baja Veggie Dog. And for those of you who live in Frogtown or near it, Wax Paper is serving a Patt Morrison sandwich throughout this weekend. I wish I were closer because I would totally do that. At the end of the hour, Pat will wrap up the event, but right now, let me turn it over to her, the inimitable Patt Morrison.
Thank you, Char. Thank you so much for doing this. We're all very grateful, and for the work you do as well. So we want to welcome all of you to LA River X, the panel entitled, Look at the LA River, What Do You See? Now, we're in the world capital of image versus reality, of image over reality, of image even subverting reality. So I can't think of a fitter approach to looking at this river. And this year we gather via Zoom, a virtual get-together for a river that in some ways is still virtual itself. It's a place that is right now still one of maybe imagination more than reality. And when I wrote my book about the river, my old friend Ray Bradbury, who was a shaper of our modern imagination, Ray was kind enough to write for the jacket of my book that I prove there's water in the LA River 425 days a year. It could happen. I'm equally proud to say my book was once the most stolen book from the Cal State Library system. I don't know if you put that on a resume or not. So let's exercise our imagination through the imagery of what the river was and is and can yet be. And our panel is singularly qualified for this. First, Dr. Tilly Hinton, the founder of the LA River X undertaking. She literally moved across the planet from Australia to befriend and work with the LA River. The late River St. Lewis MacAdams told her her job is articulating and protecting the river's future mythology. So she's a warrior for the river and for all that it can be. Thank you, Tilly.
Thanks, it's so great to be here.
Peter Bennett comes from a family of artists and creators, and 5 years ago formed Citizen of the Planet. It's devoted to distributing his words and images that focus on environmental subjects, including water and air quality. His work is widely distributed in well-known publications and in a half dozen books, with another one in the works. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
T.Chick McClure is an artist and transgender human born on the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. Much of Chick's childhood was spent moving from one military town to another. In 1990, Chick was accepted to the School of Art Institute of Chicago, focusing there on painting and drawing. And in 1997, Chick moved to LA to work in animation, winning a Latin Grammy and VMA for Best Animated Music Video. But not until Chick picked up a camera and used it in earnest did they find its power and the siren appeal of the LA River as a subject. Thank you, Chick.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
And Margaret Bennett proves the maxim that I came up with years ago, that there are two kinds of Angelinos, the ones lucky enough to be born here and smart enough to move here. Margaret moved here from the lush and beautiful Willamette Valley in Oregon, and now she's based in Silver Lake. Her exploration of the hidden places in Los Angeles inspire her drawings that are both whimsical and scientifically accurate and full of acute observation, as you'll be seeing shortly. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with a kind of Gestalt lightning round, and we'll start with Margaret Bennett. The first question is, what did you think when you first laid eyes on the LA River?
Hi, thanks for having me. It's actually Margaret Gallagher. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. How did I get that conflated? I so apologize.
No problem. I think I've seen the name Margaret Bennett around recently, so it's somewhere out there.
Boy, talk about subliminal. Margaret Gallagher, please.
So what did I see when I first, what did I think when I first saw the LA River? Not much. I think I could sum it up as not much. You know, I remember driving over it, and I think the thing that I noticed more than anything was the beautiful stonework on the bridge, and my eyes kind of slid over the river. And I think that might be a common thread in many people's experience with the river, that their first view didn't amount to much, but their perspective may have changed dramatically as time went on.
And that's something that artists will be able to, I hope, play and work to their advantage. Chick, what about you?
Well, my first experiences with the LA River were through film and television first. I didn't grow up in Los Angeles, but for a time in my childhood, we lived in Oxnard, so I was very familiar with Southern California. And when we moved away, I knew like, oh, I have to get back to Los Angeles as soon as I possibly can. And then when I got to LA, I was kind of fascinated with the river. It's this, you know, it's iconic in film and television, but then when you see it, it's like, what exactly is going on here? I'm not totally sure. So I would say that was my first impression in person with the river.
Did it disappoint?
Oh, no. It didn't disappoint me. I was just fascinated with what is going on here and why is it all concreted in. And then I did a little research, and who knows if my research is great or not, but I have read that before they made it go through these concrete channels, it would just overflow and wash people away. So I don't know. I've just been sort of fascinated with it because I think what it is that there's this, I don't find it this way, but I think there's like maybe a perception of it that maybe it's ugly or, gritty, but it's beautiful too. And I'm just drawn to those types of things in my work anyway, finding the beauty in something that is not considered to be beautiful.
Of course, it's a Western river in the sense of feast or famine, and Hinton comes from Australia, where the climate is not dissimilar in places from the climate here. And Tilly, you kind of fell in love with the river before you ever laid eyes on it.
I did. I came to Los Angeles in 2009 as a tourist, and I had just come out of a multi-year environmental campaign to rescue my childhood river from being inundated by a mega dam. We won that campaign as a community, and our victory was closely followed by me getting on a plane and making this vacation trip to LA. I knew nothing about the river. And so when I met the river, my initial thinking, which is now hilarious, having devoted 10 or so years of my life to studying people's emotional affinity with this strange place, my first reaction was, I bet nobody cares about this river. I compared it to my own, which was bucolic. It was rural. It was full of remarkable creatures and, dotted with farms and beauty. And I thought, this isn't a proper river. I bet nobody cares about it. So imagine my surprise to discover how profoundly this river matters to people, always has and always will. And that has kind of animated my work ever since. Slight twist to the story is that the place that I was when I had that initial encounter turns out to be a channelized tributary of the Santa Ana River in Orange County, and the person who was showing me around was a little geographically confused. So I didn't, in fact, meet the LA River until I returned a couple of years later, by then enrolled as a graduate student, and I had my first proper meeting with the river down in the southern reaches right by Long Beach.
So you met the understudy, but not the real thing.
That is exactly right.
That's such an LA story. What can I say?
Isn't it?
And in fact, there would not be a Los Angeles if it were not for the river, because when it was a real river, as Chick was talking about, that's where the Native Americans founded their villages, along the river, because that was the source of fresh water. So forget about the beach. This was the place where it all started. Each of our panelists has provided us with an image that to them sums up something of their sense of the river. And I mentioned Margaret Gallagher's artwork, and I want to show you the artwork that she chose to represent her vision. And she can describe briefly to us what that represents to her.
Sure. So I lived in LA for many years without a car, and I moved about 6 years ago, a couple blocks away from the river, and I was really craving a connection with nature. And I started walking down by the river, and it's at that point that it started to sort of slide into my consciousness as something not to be overlooked. And I became really entranced by, first of all, just by the amount of wildlife that's present at the river. You know, despite its degraded appearance, it's this really incredible hub and resource for birds and plants and animals, some of them invasive, but many of them native, and many of them thriving because of the river's natural resources that, you know, we as a city of Los Angeles have done our best to, I suppose, pervert that's not quite the word I want to use, but, you know, to degrade or to bend to our own ends. Despite that, all this wildlife is still surviving and thriving there. And so that's what this picture represents for me. You know, it brings together, it shows a picture of this thriving ecology, and brings together some of the contradictions that you see when you visit the river. You know, you see a lot of trash and you see invasive species, and yet you see, you know, a great blue heron. And if you've visited the river, you see like a million great blue herons. They're having a really good time and doing just fine there. And you get a glimpse of the Fletcher Street Bridge in the background with one of those kind of typical LA sunset lights. And this is a really typical scene for somebody who visits the river. And so that's what I wanted to capture, so that people who have been there can recognize it and feel an affinity for it, and people who haven't been there might be surprised and might be interested and might want to learn more about what is going on there.
And for years, the bridges have been probably the more identifiable feature of the river. And the man who designed most of these bridges, Merrill Butler, studied his craft from a matchbook cover school of engineering. He wasn't even a legitimate full-time bridge builder, but we have some remarkable bridges. And T.Chick McClure's image, which was shot from the 4th Street Bridge, has a very noir sense to it. And so describe this image of the river and why it mattered to you.
Well, I love, first of all, I love how mammoth it is and how all of this activity is going on. And beneath this beautiful Beaux Arts bridge, and I don't know if this is the same architect that you were just referring to, Pat, but this bridge, this Buena Vista Aqueduct Bridge, is so, so beautiful. And I love that you can see, you know, the mountains that surround us and the distant background, but just like how huge and how, if you look in the very bottom right-hand side, there's a person that's walking down there. And I like to keep the mystery about what's going on in an image, so I couldn't tell you what they're actually doing, but it just, I think it just has a sense of mystery. It does have a noir sense, and a lot of my work, I shoot a lot of my work in the pre-dawn and dawn time periods of the morning, which makes this really amazing light, and there aren't very many people out. So it just feels very kind of mysterious to me and majestic, but also really quiet. I don't know, it's got, for me, it has a lot of, it has an emotional feel, like it has sort of sort of, to me, what feels like authenticity of emotion. You know, like the visuals may add up to whatever they've add up to, but in my heart, it's like, it feels emotionally true to me.
And for Peter, the image you provided, you took last May near Atwater. What makes this so evocative for you?
I think this just represents the change that I always see. It was interesting. I had gone down to this location last winter, and I had seen a shot that I wanted to take. It was of all these trees, but they were bare and it was very stark. But I could only take it from the pedestrian equestrian bridge, but it was blocked off because there was an unfortunate accident. So I came back in May, and I had in my head what I wanted to shoot. And of course, it didn't look anything like it. And I was standing on the bridge, and I was just kind of looking down, somewhat disappointed, because expectations will always disappoint you, especially with the river. And I just looked down and I saw this young girl just walking back and forth and back and forth. And, you know, I call it walking on water, because I really couldn't tell what she was doing. And I shot maybe like 40 or 50 frames because I just kept being fascinated by her going back and forth. And the lushness, I'd never really seen the river looking like this. And you had asked about the first time people saw the river, and one of the shots in the slideshow was a close-up of some graffiti as I exited the 6th Street Bridge the first time I saw that tunnel in 2008. And, you know, the contrast between this kind of graffiti-laden, you know, concrete river with this, and obviously it's a different location. I mean, the river's just a really amazing canvas that provides so many different opportunities and scenes, and this one just kind of excited me.
And Tilly, you didn't give us an image, but that multiplicity that Peter was talking about, the river is 52 miles long, and you could argue there are 52 different LA rivers. If you look at Atwater, if you go up to Studio City, this is a river where there's a soft bottom, where there are trees, where are wildlife, and people want more of that. If you go south of downtown, if you go to Maywood, if you go all the way toward Long Beach, you have a river that people see as the paved river that's protecting them from flooding, protecting their houses. So how do we pitch an image of a river as something people want and should covet and should be invested in, when their original ideas about what it does for them are so different just from the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of our massive storytelling opportunities with this river, is that every single mile is drenched with meaning. And even within those sort of broad categorizations, it's being challenged, right? So if you go to Southgate, you can get right down in the riverbed. It's enormously expansive. It's entirely concrete. It's so big that an entire arts festival is held there once a year in the riverbed, not on its banks, but right down in the bed. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is to accept that this river will forever and should forever have a multiplicity of meanings. It's something that I learned when I undertook an fairly extensive program of oral history interviews. And when I started that work, I thought we should have conversations about the bed of the river, you know, the concrete banks, the bike paths, the small riparian zone that has kind of managed to survive on the edges sometimes. And then I realized as I talked that we needed to be talking about the tributaries, we needed to be talking about the entire watershed. It had to be a bigger conversation. And one of the things that I'm working on with LA River X is to tell stories of the entire 51 miles, and I'm not there yet. You'll see if you scroll back through our year and some of imagery, it does focus more than it perhaps should on the middle stretches of the river, the photogenic parts of the river. But lately, we've had a southern stretch of the river takeover by Dr. Sarah G. Grant, who's a wonderful bird watcher based in Long Beach. And so, you know, it will spread with time. I hope that we can tell more and more stories of the different stretches, and also the fact that every time a photographer or a cyclist or a fisherman or just an observer goes to the river, they see somewhere different. And that was so much a part of my impetus for LA River X, was let's create a living archive of all of those different things that one might see at the river, because otherwise they're ephemeral. Mm-hmm. And as a historian, I guess it's just in my bones to want to preserve things. And so LA River X is kind of part of that quest to preserve those stories.
And a lot of the challenge that artists have too is to bring the awareness to people, even of the, the fact of the existence of the river. One thing I like to do to rattle people on the west side when they say, "Where do you live?" I say, "I live east of the river." And you see a blank look cross their faces and they, "River? What river are you talking about? Los Angeles has a river." And so Margaret, you know, as you look at this river and you want to inform people about what it is and what its potential is, first of all, you have to make them aware that it's even there. And so what do you want people to know first about the river, your introduction to people who don't know it's there?
That's an interesting question. And I think one of the main things to think about in answering it is how many different ideas people have of what a river is, which is what this whole conversation is touching on. I grew up in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. Similar to Tilly, I grew up near a really wild and lush river, you know, surrounded by fields and forests and filled with fish and birds. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I was first introduced to the LA River, I really discounted it. My brain didn't register it as a river. And so you have, in LA, you have people coming from places like where I came from, you know, any part of the world or the US that's wetter, people have an idea of what a river is and what a river means that's very different from what a river in Southern California in particular means, and what the LA River on top of that more specifically means. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer your question right on the head, but something that I think is really important for people to understand about the LA River is something about like the nature of rivers in Southern California, which is that they're much smaller than a lot of the rivers that people across the world or across the country are used to. And I think even in LA, we have so few rivers here that a lot of people's ideas of rivers come from our media and come from those images like the Hudson River, for example, of, you know, a mighty flowing river. But in Southern California, our rivers are much smaller, and they're largely seasonal. So a lot of streams have no water in them at all for a great part of the year. That's not the case with the LA River, in part because there's sort of human added water flowing through it. But I think even without that, in its natural state, there would be water flowing through it year round. I mean, anyone can correct me about that. I might be mistaken, even though in the height of the summer, it might be a lot of a smaller flow.
One of the points you made when we talked earlier was about the resilience. I mean, and that's a parallel to Los Angeles. People come here to reinvent themselves. And here is a river that has struggled and reinvented itself and managed to come back even against everything that has been done to marginalize it.
Yes, exactly. You know, despite being channelized, you know, despite dealing with a lot of pollution and a lot of development in and around it, it's still flowing to this day, and it's still full of wildlife. And I think resilience is kind of the key word there, which is an idea that can really connect with a lot of people. The river is incredibly resilient, you know, in its innate nature as a river in Southern California. And then despite what we have done to it, it's still thriving.
And Chick, we see the world through Hollywood images, and we see ourselves, we see Los Angeles through images. So apropos of what we were talking about with Margaret, how do you introduce, how do you convey the river to people who may live 10 miles away but who've never seen it. And you want them to know it you want them to meet it in the right fashion. How should people meet the river?
Well, I mean, I love people to meet the river through an artist's eye, whether that's a writer or a visual artist. You know, like when people look at my pictures that I've taken of the river and they're not very aware of it, they are like, what is this giant gutter? What is this giant sewer you're taking pictures of? And I'm like, it's not a giant gutter and it's not a sewer. It's like, it's a real river that was here before LA grew up around it, and it's gonna always be here. You know, and it's you know, it's multi-layered. It's not one thing. It's like a layer of a bunch of different things, how people perceive it. You know, it's I don't know, it's like a really good lasagna. It's got layers.
I want your recipe.
Okay. I'm gonna write that up.
We'll have to share it on this site. But as you say, so many people have that as their first introduction to the river, and they need to see more. And artists would have, I think, an obligation to be able to bring that layeredness to a population that gets frozen on a single image, which, as you say, is the gutter.
I totally agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. So it's great that, you know, I can go out and take pictures and then bring something to somebody that doesn't know about this and you know, pique their interest. So
and Peter, there's more. If you add it up, there's more land in the LA River than there is in Central Park, and yet it is the most underused natural resource I think we have. And it's virtually all of it is chained off except for parts of it. It was, at least a while ago, illegal to be in the bed of the LA River without like a filming permit. So is it important for people to actually go to the river and be there and see it, as well as experience it through the images of the artists, as we've been talking about?
Yeah, you know, it's funny, we talk about the resurgence of the river, but Lewis always said that, you know, it wasn't the river that's been kind of a resurgence of, it's people's relationship to it. And I think that's the result of many things. It's been people like artists like us portraying the river. I've led tours for years. I was first introduced to the river by Jenny Price, who was a naturalist who took me up and down the river. Folar and a lot of the work that people are doing, and Tilly.
And the Grand Limpieza, the cleanup where kids.
Yes, and the cleanup actually, and Folar's told me that it's not so much cleaning up is great, but it only puts a dent in, and it's really to introduce people to the river. And you know, it's also the idea that the river is there for recreation. When I first started going and photographing the river in 2008, like you said, it was chained off, and you couldn't. It was George Wolfe used to try to put his kayak into the river and would, you know, undoubtedly get arrested. And then he led an expedition of people like from the Sepulveda Basin down to Long Beach over 3 days. And it changed the classification of the river from an unnavigable river to a navigable river. And the EPA then made it a navigable river, which gave it a lot of clean water protection. And after that, they developed the recreation zone in the Elysian Valley. And now people are like astonished that they can kayak. And I photographed the first boat race on the river. And I think it's fishing and there's so many things that now become part of the river. And just quickly, the southern part of the river is very used by the population down there because there's really kind of a lack of parkland. So people in the hot summer days, they'll go down to that wide concrete and ride their bikes and walk and ride horses because that's where it's cool and that's the only kind of access to recreational areas that they have. So yes.
So experiencing it personally gives you a different relationship with it and maybe invest you in it in a way you wouldn't be otherwise.
Absolutely, and it's changing more and more. I think ultimately it's going to be the centerpiece of Los Angeles. There's so many stakeholders and there's so much interest in the river and what it offers and the potential of it. And, you know, we haven't even gotten into the whole water conservation aspect, but yes.
Well, and Tilly, the flip side of so many stakeholders and so much interest is that everyone now has a vision of Los Angeles. There's a concern that it's going to be improved, not for its own sake, but because rich people may be thinking this is an opportunity. And if you look at Paris, the Seine is paved. And the Seine is a major player in a million different movies in the life of Paris itself. So how can all these multiple visions be brought to bear in a way that's going to really make something of the river for the people for whom it's maybe the last opportunity in the biggest park poor city in the country?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to say is that we need to recognize that the river has always been full of stories. And, you know, we've touched on that already in this discussion. It's not like the river just came to exist lately because it was declared to be traditionally navigable or because of the recreation zones or the developments along the river. It's always been such an alive cultural landscape for the humans of Los Angeles. It's just that lately a broader spectrum of people have been using the river. And so I think in decisions that are made now and moving forward, we have to remember that, to not treat this as a kind of a place of emptiness or a blank canvas, but to know it as a place that is thoroughly articulated and meaningful already, and to protect those stories. It's one of the reasons that LA River X exists, to challenge the notion that the river has only just recently arrived in the cultural landscape of the city. It's always been there. And to go to Margaret's point, we have to make sure that whatever changes happen at the river, that they maintain the integrity of Southern Californian ecologies. I speak to landscape architects who tell me that, you know, one of the first steps that they take in rendering future images of the river is to try and desaturate them a little, to move them away from being a kind of Thomas Kincaid back east painting, to say, no, our colors are different here. Our landscape is about the browns and the silvers and the grays as much as it is about, you know, the blues and the greens that we're seeing in, let's say, the photo behind Pat of the river. And so to make sure that we don't impose some kind of storybook idea of what a river should properly look like, and instead use history, ecology, and people's lived experiences of the river to make sure that it's something that stays as fascinating as it has always been, and that it remains a place where people can take refuge and explore and feel alone and feel excited and feel like creativity can blossom there. All of those things, we have to keep them despite the developments at the river.
That, and in fact, that East Coast idea of what a river should look like was one of the things that doomed it, because you had people come out here from New Hampshire or New York, and well, that doesn't look like a river to me, therefore it's negligible, therefore it's not important. And that was one of the things that allowed the river to be doomed. And it seems to me, especially with the Olympics coming up, the city has an opportunity to create multiple images of the river. I collect a lot of LA postcards, and the only postcards I've ever seen of the river are postcards of the flood or of bridges going down, not of the kind of beautiful, bucolic, unpredictable river that it was before. So I'm going to Margaret first and think, imagine postcards of the LA River, using perhaps some of your art to convey that sense to people far beyond this place and the people here, that it's worthy of these images.
Yeah, I mean, I think any postcard of the river, any of the images that the artists that are here today or that have participated in LA River X would make beautiful, poignant postcards. There are so many. I think the crucial thing to capture about the river is all of these juxtapositions that are inherent in it. You have these, I guess, some broad stroke juxtapositions of like nature versus human development. You know, you have wildlife and pollution. You have things like, you know, beautiful architecture and development, and then you also have communities of unhoused people living in the rivers. And I think there's so much beauty and possibility and tension, artistic tension inherent in those juxtapositions. And that's what in my opinion, the best images of the river speak to that and capture that. I don't think, you know, I think even like an idealized version of the river contains that, because, you know, it no longer exists as what it once was in a, wild isn't the right word to use for it, but an uncolonized, Europeanized landscape. I think any image of the river that captures its beauty today has to capture some of those contradictions and juxtapositions in it.
And Chick, to look at your image, the one you shared with us, this is not what people would think, oh, here's a river, because it's not prettified, it's not saccharinized, it's not Kincaid-ized, to use Tilly's reference. And that too is the river. And we need that, as Margaret was saying, that multiplicity of senses of this is what it is, folks. And it's your river in your city, and this is Los Angeles, you know, good, bad, ugly, although ugly is not even a word that I would use for that.
Yeah, ugly's not the word. I mean, I think there's a perception out there that it's ugly. Like, it's not my view of that, but it's sort of making the, it's finding what's exquisite about it, and what is exquisite about it is all of the story and all of those contradictions that Margaret was just talking to. Like, there's an authenticity about this river that that's maybe not, I don't know. It's outside of any like common definition of river, or what you would expect from a river.
Right. I remember seeing a photograph that the man who did the photographs for my book took, and it was a pair of slippers and a little scrap of towel left at the edge of the water by some homeless person who may have and may have been planning to use it as, like, that was his bathing that day. And that was so moving and so evocative, as much as any of the lovely images that we would see, say, in Atwater. And I think that that goes to what you're saying about the multiplicity, and it's something that the city needs to see as well as people on the outside. Peter, how about that?
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Peter, and then we'll go back to Chick.
Well, you know, I think a lot of my work has always been about introducing people to the river in one way or another. As I said, I led photographic tours there, and to me, the biggest thrill was like seeing the people's face when they first saw the river. I think there's something special about the first time you see the LA River and you're trying to figure out what you're looking at, you know? And as everyone said, it's not like a typical Western river, Eastern river, it is what it is. And that's what makes it so phenomenal. Number of years, Curved LA did a series of images I got from the library about the LA River before it was paved. And I thought it'd be really fun to go out, and I recreated about 9 of those pictures from the exact spot that it was taken, same framing, same lens, everything I could. And it was so much fun, but it was so interesting to kind of, you know, be standing there. It was like time travel, and kind of, I'd have the old image on my iPad and I'd be shooting the new image, and seeing that juxtaposition of what was and what is. We're never going back to that, but we're moving forward to something I think special. You know, when all the stakeholders will kind of, you know, get wherever they're getting, it will be something, I think, as I said.
What a great storytelling device.
Yeah.
Chick, you were going to say something?
Well, I've forgotten what it was. But,
I'm wondering if Char has some questions for us from everyone who's watching us.
Actually, I do have a question from Betsy asking of Peter and the others, actually. What noticeable changes could you see once the river was designated navigable? That was a sort of iconic moment, but then what happens?
Well, they turned it into the recreation zone, and people were actually putting their kayaks or renting kayaks and going on tours. And Jim Burns, you know, does his fly fishing thing, and people were walking and the bike paths got elongated, and soon you'll be able to go from like, all the way at the start of the river to Long Beach. So it's accessibility. When I first started leading tours, it was all about going through chain link fences and this and that, and it was mysterious. People stopped coming because there was no more mystery. They could just go themselves. It wasn't scary. And it's just been dramatic over the last few years.
Someone else have a say on that?
Other thing that's changed is that we now have more ammunition in making the argument that this is a river to be taken seriously. And so when encountering that so frequent comment of, oh, it's not really a river, it's not a proper river, it's just a channel, being able to say it is a traditionally navigable waterway regarded as such by the EPA adds some strength to our arm, I think, in remembering that this is not human-made infrastructure entirely, but rather a really diverse, alive ecology. And that helps, I think, to be able to tell that story.
And as I remember, the designation also changed the practice that the Army Corps had been doing, which is to turn it into a water freeway. It wanted water to move as fast as possible and as much water. So to that end, every year it graded away all the vegetation and all the little hillocks of dirt that had accumulated into islands where the birds would nest, and really just sort of barbered it away. And now those are allowed to build up and to cultivate and to provide shelter and places for wildlife. Is that right, Peter and Tilly?
I'd say it's partially right. So as you'd know, the river is under the jurisdiction of many, many different cities, about 13 or so, plus the county, plus the Army Corps of Engineers. And so there's no singular approach, unfortunately, to preservation of the river ecologies. And so still there are instances of grading and of the riverbed, but it happens certainly less than in the days where Lewis MacAdams had to stand in front of the bulldozers.
What a hero, Lewis.
Yeah.
We're going to put up new statues as we should. Lewis should be on the list, I think. Do we have another question, Char?
Yeah, we do actually, and it plays off of what Tilly just talked about. Given all of those agencies, is there a mechanism by which to coordinate their behavior? Or are they so fiefdom-like that that's a really hard sell to them or collectively? What's the play there?
Yes, that's a good question, because it seems like the parable of the little red hen who nobody would help her when she was growing the wheat, nobody would help when she was grinding the wheat, but when it came time to eat the bread, everybody was in there and wanted literally a piece of it.
Frank Gehry wanted a piece. Like, where was he 20 years ago?
You've got politicians who definitely want to be there cutting a ribbon and getting their picture taken on something, but what that something will be is a subject of disagreement up and down. Tilly, you can talk, I think, to some extent about that.
Yeah, I mean, what history tells us, recent history tells us that a coordinated approach to river management is a gargantuan task that nobody has cracked the code for yet. And I'm not sure that presently there's all that much of an appetite for it either, certainly in the policy decisions that we're seeing happen. What we are seeing, though, are some large-scale projects that are really significant for the river. So on the east bank in the Central River, the 100 acres of continuous green space that is essentially a joint project of California State Parks and the city of LA. At least that gets us somewhere closer to a coordinated approach, but we're talking about a quite small stretch of the 51 miles. There have been attempts in the past to establish a whole of river authority, a catchment authority. They haven't come off. There are just so many players and so many interests that it's hard to imagine a time where that becomes a reality. But gosh, I hope it does, because we need to think of the river much more cohesively than we do.
And let me ask that, Tilly, and also sort of pitch this to Peter because he raised this issue. Tibby wants to know, are there ways by which that new designation of the river is navigable, its own weird language, that protects the tributaries, protects effectively the larger watershed that you referred to, Tilly? It's crucial to think theoretically about watersheds, but we're actually talking about physical space also. And I'm just curious, Peter, has there been any sort of gesture beyond the river itself to say that the whole of this space could be protected?
I can't answer that per se, but I'm going to take a good guess here and say that none of the tributaries that I'm aware of would come close to being navigable. They're just don't have the depth. They have those culverts sometimes, and it's just not really kind of feasible to put any kind of boat down it. You know, I just kind of wanted to add, because we haven't kind of talked about the water conservation, but you know, a lot of it is there's privately owned land and all the negotiations to try to get that. You know, the paving of it was really 1930s technology addressing the problem at the time. And here we are in 2020. And, you know, there's much more intelligent ways of dealing with flooding. And at the same time, you know, we're in a drought. The water comes in, what little water we comes in is now designed to go out to the ocean as fast as possible. It makes
what a waste.
No sense. It's brainless, but that's the current situation. So we have to find ways of retaining water, percolating it down, and finding ways that we can hold the precious water that we do get, especially with more and more droughts coming.
Yeah, the formula that was used to cement over the river is virtually impermeable, but there are new permeable substances that can work. The city has not wanted to give up any land that it could possibly sell as real estate to spreading basins to allow the water to go back in. So the river is the natural place to reintroduce some permeability and to save water that way, because Peter's right. Enough water for 100,000 families a year just gets flushed down the river. That's what they just dump it back in the ocean. And it's completely wasteful in a time of drought that we should be doing that. So Tar, was there another question?
Oh, there's plenty.
Okay.
And this is a broader question, but it goes right to what we're talking about also, which is what about the local NGOs, the nonprofits, Council for Watershed Health, all these various organizations. Is there, if the agencies are coordinated, are these more grassroots oriented organizations a conduit perhaps, if not a galvanizing set of organizations to force some of these issues?
Who would like to take that?
Could start on that one. This seems like a good juncture to mention Friends of the LA River, who this month are doing a fantastic Saturday morning Live at the River event that we all can watch online. FOLA were one of the very first LA River X guest hosts. They were number 2 when I began this a year ago. And obviously they're a crucial voice. They're the longest standing nonprofit advocating for the river. And so their programming this month, which is, it's really broad ranging. It's has a naturalist focus, it has an Indigenous cultures focus, a political focus. They're doing all kinds of good things every Saturday morning. So we're really fortunate to have advocates like Friends of the LA River. There are others as well. There still probably is not a singular conversation. There is lower river planning discussions happening and upper river strategic planning discussions happening. And perhaps that's the best we can hope for, is that chunks of the river have attention paid to them in a fairly cohesive way. And that's work that's led by the county and then the various city municipalities. Even that is better than nothing, I think.
So I want to ask Margaret and Chick to talk about this in the sense of where your work is about what we see in the river now. How can an artist contribute a sense of what the river might be when we have a lot of visions? I won't say competing and conflicting, but certainly a lot of visions of what it might be. Where would an artist's work come into this? Margaret?
I think there's a kernel of every possible future of what the river might be is inherent in it at present. And one of the powerful ways that art can come in is every person, but specifically every artist, you know, comes in with such a unique perspective. And many artists are accustomed to seeking out unique perspectives to investigate and highlight through their artwork. And so, you know, personally through my artwork, I'm really interested in the nature and ecology aspect, not only of what's there right now, but what has been there in the past and what could be there again, you know, through human efforts to improve and mitigate the environment and through, you know, nature's own resilience. And so, you know, for example, I really love frogs and amphibians, and I think a lot of people don't realize that there are native frogs and amphibians that still live in the river today, and that fact is so like incredibly hopeful to me, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of that. And so that's something that I really want to highlight through my artwork that can tell a really powerful story that brings together both the past, the present, and the future of the river. Of, you know, maybe someday we can bring back a lot of that native wildlife to the river.
And to make Frogtown more real, not just a name.
Exactly. And there are frogs in Frogtown.
I know, but we need more.
Yes, we
need steelhead trout for that matter.
Right. A lot of people say even 10, 20, 30 years ago, there were so many more frogs in Frogtown. People have really strong memories and impressions of that particular aspect of the river from not that long ago.
And Chick?
For me, I think it's just a matter of like putting attention and focus on it and giving it importance and elevating it. You know, it could go a million different directions, how you might visualize where it would go. But I think just for me, it would be about elevating it in its current state and giving the LA River overall an importance and a fascination and drawing people into it so that they become aware of it themselves, and maybe even through that take some sort of ownership as Angelinos, like, yeah, this is our river, and it's something special.
Maybe we need one of those signs in Hollywood sign font that says LA River, and the tourists would eat it up.
Well, yeah, you could definitely take tours of the river from tourists coming in. I don't know what they would think, but at first,
they would think it's part of Universal Studios backlot, I suppose.
There you go.
Char, do we have another question?
Well, we do, and we have some comments. One of which is that because the river is navigable, its tributaries by definition are environmentally protected. Interesting.
Good.
And that actually that's a logical way to think about it. There's a question, and we're sort of nudging around on that at this point, like what is the future? Like, can we have that conversation? One of whom has asked, you know, are there plans to remove concrete in places where that's possible? And that would be part of it. But Margaret sort of raised the question by species, like what's the future of the biodiversity of this place? But I'd also be curious if the panelists could talk a bit about from their vantage point in 20 years, what should this river look like?
Peter, do you want to start?
Oh,
yeah, sorry about that.
I hope I'm here in 20 years to see it.
Fair enough.
That's my answer. You know, I don't know, a couple of questions there. I don't know what the plans are to remove concrete. I was just going to say one brief thing about permeability. It's not just the river. It's the whole Los Angeles basin had become more impermeable, which led to all the flooding. And so making the basin and outlying areas more permeable will help reduce the flooding. I just kind of wanted to throw that in there. So it's not all the focus on solution shouldn't be the river. I know they do want to remove concrete in some areas. I think if you talk to the, some people there, they have plans to do it, other people not so much. I don't know if all the designs are in. There's still so much negotiation. I would just love to see it more accessible. I would love to see people, you know, this is the third time I'm going to say it, a centerpiece of the city. So, you know, you're visiting downtown LA, you go down to see the river. You know, when I first started photographing the 6th Street Bridge at night, you know, I parked my car and it was like really creepy. And I wondered if my car would be there when I got back. And the last time I took a picture of the river before it was dismantled, there was valet parking. And I said, it's changing. And it's, you know, there's more people coming down there, and that's just going to continue. And what it'll look like physically, I hope it incorporates what Margaret says about species and nature and indigenous plants and indigenous fish. We shall see.
I think it should be like the real jungle ride at Disneyland. We should have little paddle boats and we go through and see the birds and the frogs. And I think that would be terrific as a downtown attraction. Let's see, who else was going to answer that question? Maybe quickly, Tilly?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I would want to see even more connectivity, more bike paths, more ability to walk and to move along the length of the river. It's crucial that in 20 years' time, we have cultural and socioeconomic diversity in the people who live around the river and the community kind of amenity that exists around the river. The risk of beautifying a place like the LA River is that it can become impossibly expensive and can drive out the very communities for whom the river has been.
And that's already a
important
concern.
place.
Yes.
It's already happening, and it's something that has got to be turned around with good public policy and responsible development. So for me, it would be about connectivity, diversity, and of course, permeability, that we need to get better at what happens to the water across the watershed and once it lands in the channel too.
We have time for a couple more questions or comments, Char.
If someone would like to shoot a question in, that would be fantastic.
We do have a technical question from a photographer who just featured on LA River X, who wants to know from Chick what camera you are shooting on. She was wondering if it is a medium frame camera or not.
Well, with these, I was using a Canon 5D Mark III, which is a full frame, has a full frame sensor in it. The way that I shoot these I'm kind of shooting them in pieces and putting them together, not to manipulate the image to appear differently, but to make it so that I could have very large prints of these, so without losing detail.
Another one, a question or comment, Char?
Not so far. People are loving it and sending in thank yous. I'm scrolling back up through to see.
I think everybody has a different sense of when the LA River will be a successful river. And Lewis MacAdams said it was when there were steelhead trout in the river again. For me, it may be when I'm gone and my ashes can be thrown in the LA River and they just won't stay there. They'll get washed away in the summer.
There actually is one question earlier in the session that really speaks to the question that we've been talking about in terms of watershed and the overarching notion of a river that doesn't yet have a set of sort of agency-wide coordination, and references Marin County, where there's an organization called One TAM, meaning Tamalpais, that coordinates the myriad agencies, water districts, parks, and that oversees this open space. And top up, top down may be helpful. Bottom up, I think Tilly's point was well taken, that given the myriad of communities and different interests that they hold and the demographics that are strung out along it, it might be better bottom up, but you know, bottom up, middle out, top down. I think we probably need all sorts of those kinds of forces to really make this river sing.
Char, can you read something I just saw pop up? It's kind of a confession from someone named Sean.
Yeah, so this is from Sean, and I think a lot of us probably will recognize ourselves in it. I was the geographically challenged person who showed Tilly the wrong river. I lived in LA all my life, and Tilly showed me a river I didn't even know existed. Good line.
Bravo.
Although I have to
Thank you,
say,
Sean.
the Santa Ana, like the LA, is the same kind of river.
Yeah.
It's
Easy to
alluvial,
mistake them.
it flows all over the place, and it's quite logical that you would see that, and the San Gabriel for that matter.
Yeah.
Rivers that don't get nearly as much play, but they're exactly the same construct.
In the 19 teens and 20s, the real estate salesman would sell real estate along the San Gabriel River and show in their artwork pitches steamboats going up the San Gabriel River. And in the newspapers in the 1950s, on April Fool's Day, they would advertise LA River luxury cruises. So to Peter's point, maybe we'll get back to that. We'll have like cruises on the river, and that would
be awesome.
Be fantastic.
Yeah.
This discussion makes me think that when we talk about the river's future, we often talk about what we want to change. But I hope that we also, and this is one of the things that LA River X is all about, let's think about what we need to keep. And we need to keep that artistic freedom, you know, that people can be down at the river creating. We need to keep the wildness and the surprise that you can be a couple of minutes from downtown and feel like you are in this absolute wilderness. So the quest to always change the river is an interesting human desire for betterment. It's part of the reason that we have a channelized river in the first place. And I hope that we also will keep that desire to maintain some things so that people like Margaret and Peter and T.Chick can keep making incredible art about this strange and surprising place rather than a kind of perfect and manicured place that some people might like to make it.
And we also have made the river, by virtue of trying to make it not a river, we've made it very inward focused. We've made it turn its back on the city. And I think we need to turn that perspective around 180 degrees too, to everyone's point about welcoming people to the river, showing people the river in all of its manifold faces, and making people identify with it the way they do now with Griffith Park or with the beach or with the Hollywood, as part of the city that they live in, an integral part of the city that they live in. So I do want to thank everybody. I have some announcements I want to get through, and thanks as well. Starting with Char Miller for doing such a wonderful job here. Thank you again. At 6 p.m., an online lecture with Carrie Bible about Hollywood noir and the LA River. Plenty to talk about there. My friend Harry Dean Stanton, who filmed the movie Repo Man in the river. And when I told him I was working on the book about the river, he said, LA has a river? And I said, Harry, you made a movie in it. Oh yeah, he said. Took him a little while. So anyway, that'll be fascinating. 6 o'clock, Carrie Bible and Hollywood Noir. At 8 o'clock, LA River X alum Projected Visions invites you to a virtual dance party. It's at the Artwalk live stream. There's a music set from the Furious Seasons at 7 p.m. if you want to start the party early. Dr. Tilly Hinton is back at Artwalk tomorrow, co-presenting rose-making workshops for the Rose River Memorial Project. LA River X is currently being guest hosted, as you heard, by El Triste, the saddest marionette in Los Angeles, and his puppet master, Kane Carillas. If you have visual stories to tell about the river, you can apply to be a guest host on LA River X. Send a direct message on Instagram to Tilly, who's the founder and curator. Now we're going to ease our way out of this session with videos from previous LA River X guests, Avital Oler, excuse me if I mispronounced that, Lars Bunch, and Helen Kim. There are more videos on LA River X's IGTV, and credit and so many thanks to Micheline Cherie, who is the Artwalk co-producer, and Tracy Stone, president of the Elysian Valley Arts Collective, for inviting LA River X to feature at Artwalk, to Wax Paper for making the celebratory sandwich. You can still get the special Patt Morrison sandwich. It's a peanut butter palooza and then some. And thanks to all the LA River X guest hosts for contributing their views on this. Thanks to all of my guests, T.Chick, Margaret, Tilly, Peter, and of course, Char again. Thanks to Jacob Patterson for his impeccable event production. To Char again for the warm welcome. You can follow LA River X on Instagram and keep the river in your mind and your hearts, Angelina. Thank you very much.
Brava.
Hi, my name is Lars Bunch. I'm a photographer. I guest hosted the LA River X Instagram account in March of 2020. Why did I guest host it? Apparently Tilly had seen some photographs I'd taken and put on my Instagram account that I'd shot of the LA River and the Arroyo Seco and that sort of thing. My guess is she felt that I might be an interesting fit with the account. I took it as a very good opportunity to sort of look at the river in a different way than I had before. I'd mostly had taken photographs that were more or less one-off shots. In this case, I could, it allowed me a opportunity to sort of see the river in a more as a body of work, as a almost a documentary project, looking at different aspects of the river and seeing how, in this case, 50 images could come together to tell a kind of story about the river. Mostly, I tend to see myself as kind of an abstract photographer. For me, what's actually fascinating isn't so much the wildlife, birds, plants, insects, fish, or the people. What I find fascinating are the huge concrete structures, columns of bridges, these gigantic walls of the river. I can use those as kind of the shapes and forms that I can build an abstract composition out of. The ability to sort of do this takeover of the account provided me a way of looking at the river in a structured way that I hadn't before. And it ended up being, I feel it's a very good body of work that I'm very happy to have produced.
My name is Avital Ayler, and love talking about the LA River, probably much like most other folks that have experienced it, obsessed and super stoked to have the opportunity to discuss a little bit of my perspective on it. And I would love to explore the idea of what the river might look like in 5-10 years, or even 20 years from now. And what I would love to see, what I would love to see happen is the erosion of the cage that it finds itself in. The concrete walls that have sort of forced it into a very specific path. It would be very, very cool to see that gone, and to see what it might be like free flowing, and to understand maybe what it was like in the past, way in the past, before the European settlers, obviously such as myself, came to this area and decided that they didn't think that a river should flow freely, and rather decided that the best course of action would be to cage it up in concrete to ensure the property values of the residents around it, rather than the Tongva folk that lived around it for God knows how long, that were able to live with its ever-changing path. It would be amazing to start to see it return to that original form. Even though, of course, nothing can ever return to its original form, it would simply be amazing to see it not be encased in concrete. That's my biggest hope for the LA River in the years to come. And maybe we can call it something else also. Maybe we could think about a renaming of it. Maybe we can call it something else also. Maybe we could think about a renaming of it.
Hi, my name is Helen H. Kim, and I'm an LA-based multimedia artist. I've always been fascinated by the politics of gaze, as in who sees what, who gets to describe what they see, and ultimately who creates or influences a larger narrative about people, places, and things. I also grew up in LA, and if you're anything like me, then you have many memories of being shuttled to this place and that place. You're probably sitting in the back seat, passing the time by fighting with your siblings or looking dazed out the window. And this is exactly the kind of scenario in which I first encountered the LA River from the backseat of my family car. And it just became a really familiar, indelible part of this place that I called home. And even though I didn't know a whole lot about it until I became a grown-up, I always knew that it was seen as a bit of a joke, kind of like the city that it belonged to. As in, of course, this vapid city like Los Angeles would have a joke of a river like the LA River. But much like the city itself, I find that if you take the time and the effort to explore the river, you'll be so rewarded with an incredible experience and a wealth of history. And I kind of like the fact that the river doesn't try to seduce you. Something about its aloofness is really beguiling and enjoyable to me.
We used to kick it on that ledge right there. So many people used to camp out here.
And how was that?
I mean, everybody kept to their own group. Like, don't come over here fucking with us. We won't go over there fucking with y'all. You got a problem with somebody in our group, present it as a group appearance. Like, you're not going to see that person by themselves. Because we stay in a group.
If somebody's without a group,
and
is that cause for suspicion?
No, that just means somebody wants to be by themselves.
Okay.
Each and every one of us has been through.
Everybody that live here, the reason why they here is to get away from people. To not deal with everything.
Back in July, I had the opportunity to guest host the LA River X Instagram account, and I got to share some photos and videos from an art piece of mine called Home is Where the Heart Is. It was a map-based multimedia documentation of two friends who experienced being unhoused on the streets of LA for about 10 years. These two women, they spent some of their more peaceful times along the river when they wanted to get away from it all, but still have access to resources. And through the LA River X account, I got to share a little bit about their experiences along the river, how they spent their time, details like what the etiquette is when you approach other people living along the river, things like that. They ultimately had to leave the river because some foliage that they depended on to protect them from being seen and to give them privacy or cut down, and they had no choice but to go back to Hollywood, where they spent probably a good majority of their time being unhoused. Guest hosting was a great experience, and it brought back some fond memories of walking leisurely along the river with my two friends, asking them questions about what life was like when they lived in the streets, and it really did feel like we were getting away from it all.
Hi, my name is